There's a lie that almost everyone learns too early and pays dearly for believing in it their whole life. The idea that being good, transparent, and fair will naturally make people respect you. But just a few years in the real world are enough to realize something uncomfortable. The most manipulative people rarely seem dangerous at first. They smile, they listen, they feign virtue, they silently observe your weaknesses. And while you believe you're building trust, you might just be teaching someone exactly how to control you. Machiavelli understood this centuries ago when he spoke about politics guided by reality, not ideals. Because the world doesn't reward emotional naivete. The world rewards perception, strategy, control, and above all, people who can see the invisible game happening behind the words. The problem is that most people never learn these rules. They grow up believing that over-explaining resolves conflicts, that justice always wins, that reciprocity is guaranteed, that those who do good will inevitably receive good in return. But while some live trapped in these comfortable beliefs, others operate silently using the appearance of virtue, emotional manipulation, and strategic reading of real human nature. And here's the most dangerous part. They never attack directly. They position themselves. They shape narratives. They create urgency. They make you doubt your own perception while appearing innocent to others. And when the victim finally realizes what happened, they've usually already wasted time, energy, reputation, or even their own identity trying to maintain peace with people who never had clean intentions from the start. But there is a way out. And it doesn't require becoming cruel, paranoid, or living in constant distrust of everyone like someone who just discovered random phrases about "the end justifies the means" on the internet. True transformation happens when you learn something much more powerful: how to stop being predictable, how to control your reactions, how to use silence, patience, and emotional positioning without needing to constantly display strength. Because truly dangerous people rarely seem dangerous at first glance. They simply understand human behavior better than others. And in this video, you'll understand the 7 psychological secrets that powerful people almost never reveal publicly. Because when someone learns these rules, they begin to see manipulations that previously seemed invisible. And after that, it becomes impossible to look at certain people the same way again. If something inside you awakened while listening, don't ignore that feeling. This channel isn't about videos, it's about memories. Remember who you were before the fear, before the exhaustion, before the silence. Each new video here is a different reflection of your own soul, an invitation to understand what the world never taught you. The power you seek outside has always been within you. If you feel that this journey speaks to what lives silently within you, sign up now. Not to follow yet another creator, but to reconnect with something the world tried to make you forget. Because here, every word was made to heal, each reflection to awaken, and each video serves as a reminder. You are not alone on the path back to yourself. Click on subscribe and turn the algorithm into a daily reminder of who you really are. Some people grow up believing that kindness acts as an invisible shield. That being correct, predictable, and kind will prevent attacks, betrayals, or psychological games. But real life doesn't operate based on romantic ideals. It operates on interests, perception, and the reading of behavior. And that's precisely where many good people become easy targets, because those who manipulate people don't look for the strongest first. They look for the most predictable. Those who always respond the same way, who always give in, who always believe that the other person will act with the same honesty as they do. Machiavelli already understood this centuries ago when he spoke about politics guided by reality, not by ideals. The problem isn't being good. The problem is believing that everyone values kindness. Some people see empathy as an operational weakness. They perceive patterns. They know that the polite person will avoid conflict. They know that the available person will respond quickly. They know that the understanding friend will give another chance. And that's it. The game begins there. Not with violence, not with direct confrontation, but with small, silent exploitations that seem normal at first. A favor here. There's a sense of guilt there, a "you've changed towards me" thrown into the conversation. And when the person realizes it, they're already emotionally trapped. The curious thing is that good people are usually trained from an early age to seek reciprocity. They help expecting consideration. They listen expecting respect. They give expecting loyalty. But the reality is uncomfortable. Reciprocity is not a universal law. It's just a possibility. And those who understand real human nature know this very well. Just observe competitive environments. Companies, relationships, politics, social groups. There's almost always someone using the appearance of virtue while silently calculating advantages. That colleague who seems too humble might just be gathering information. The extremely available friend might be trying to create emotional debt. And this doesn't mean living paranoid. It means stopping treating naivete as a spiritual virtue. A simple example, when someone always asks for small favors but disappears at important times, most people try to rationalize. Oh, maybe they're busy. Maybe they're going through something. But those who develop strategic perception begin to analyze patterns, not excuses, because patterns reveal hidden intentions. That's why extremely manipulative men and women love emotionally predictable people. They offer a map, a routine, and a ready reaction. And a strategic person always prefers to fight wars where they already know the opponent's moves before the match even begins. But there's a silent turning point that completely changes the dynamic. It begins when a person understands that kindness without awareness becomes self-sabotage. And no, this doesn't mean becoming cruel, cold, or constantly trying to appear powerful, like an internet personality who discovered better to be feared than loved last night while watching motivational videos. It means learning to create real boundaries. Boundaries that don't need to be announced aloud, because those who talk too much about boundaries are usually still trying to convince others to respect them. The real change happens when your actions begin to interrupt automatic responses. When you take a little longer to respond to certain people, when you stop over-explaining, when you stop rewarding disrespect with endless understanding. The interesting thing is that, at this moment, many people begin to reveal who they really are. Some distance themselves, others get angry, others try to regain emotional control using guilt. And it is precisely there that the person realizes something unsettling. Perhaps the problem was never their kindness. Perhaps it was the fact that it was completely predictable. And those who begin to understand this inevitably discover a much more powerful weapon than direct confrontation. A weapon that almost no one notices is being used. There's a type of power that almost no one notices because it's silent. It doesn't enter a room trying to dominate the environment. It doesn't interrupt conversations, and it doesn't need to constantly prove its intelligence. On the contrary, sometimes it seems distracted, unassuming, even vulnerable. And that's precisely where the danger lies. Machiavelli understood that virtù and fortuna go hand in hand when someone learns to manipulate perception, because arrogant people reveal a lot when they believe they are above someone else. Just observe a meeting, a negotiation, or even a casual conversation between friends. When someone thinks they are dealing with a weak person, they relax. They talk too much. They show their intentions too early. They underestimate. And all underestimation creates exposure. That's why chosen weakness isn't real weakness. Often it functions as a lens, a silent test that reveals who would step on you if given the opportunity. Some people reveal their true personality the moment they believe you pose no threat. The polite person becomes arrogant. The understanding partner becomes controlling. The loyal friend starts competing in secret, and all of this becomes effortless when you stop trying to impress all the time. The most dangerous strategists in history rarely showed all their cards immediately. They understood the calculated use of force. They knew that intimidating too early makes the other person defensive. But appearing harmless creates overconfidence in the opponent. A classic example occurs in professional environments. Imagine someone who enters a new company without trying to appear the smartest person in the room. They listen more than they speak. They observe alliances. They notice who flatters bosses, who manipulates information, and who only acts when there is personal benefit. Meanwhile, the most vain begin to reveal themselves spontaneously. One of them shares too many secrets. Another criticizes colleagues behind their backs. Another tries to subtly humiliate, thinking they've found someone easy to dominate. And without realizing it, everyone begins to reveal the psychological map of their own weaknesses. This also happens in relationships. Many people reveal their character when they believe they have emotional control over someone. It is at this moment that disappearing games, validation tests, manipulation through silence, and small demonstrations of power emerge. But those who observe calmly begin to perceive invisible patterns. And perception is worth more than impulsive reaction, because those who react too quickly lose access to the most valuable information. The problem is that the ego hates to appear weak. It wants to respond quickly, win arguments immediately, and constantly demonstrate its worth. However, this constant need to prove strength ultimately leads to emotional anxiety, and anxiety is traceable. Manipulative people can sense this, almost like sharks sense blood in the water. They perceive who needs validation, who fears rejection, who can't stand being ignored. That's why constant adaptability becomes so important. Sometimes the greatest strategic move is precisely not correcting an underestimation immediately. Let the other person believe they are comfortable in control while you observe how far they would go if they had a real advantage. This isn't cowardice. It's emotional intelligence applied to reality. It's understanding that decisions based on real human nature produce better results than momentary emotional outbursts. And curiously, when someone stops trying to win every small battle, they begin to see entire wars happening around them. Conversations begin to have hidden layers. Compliments start to sound like tests. Criticism ceases to seem like accidents. People realize that you're rarely attacked for who you are. They usually attack you because of the emotional power they believe they hold over you. And those who understand this begin to understand why certain people talk too much when they feel they're in control, especially when they realize you still feel the need to justify yourself. There's a psychological trap that destroys more authority than most people imagine: the constant need to explain oneself. And the most dangerous thing is that this almost always seems like a virtue. The person believes they are being mature, transparent, and fair. But often, they are simply handing over emotional power to the other person, because the moment someone feels obligated to excessively justify their decisions, they automatically put the other person in the position of judge. It's as if they are silently saying, "Here are my reasons. Now decide if they are valid." Machiavelli understood something that bothers many people to accept. Whoever controls the emotional structure of the conversation controls its outcome. And strategically manipulative people know exactly how to induce endless explanations. They ask seemingly innocent questions, but why did you do that? Why did you change with me? Why didn't you answer? And without realizing it, the person begins to defend themselves against accusations that weren't even made directly. The problem is that the more they talk, the more material they give away, because every long explanation reveals insecurity, a need for approval, or a fear of displeasing. And an attentive person transforms this into emotional ammunition very quickly. Observe how emotionally strong individuals tend to act. They don't spend half an hour trying to convince someone that their boundaries are legitimate. They don't give emotional PowerPoint presentations explaining why they were unavailable, tired, or distant. They simply communicate decisions clearly, short, direct. This is because they understood a fundamental thing about politics guided by reality, not ideals. Not every conversation exists for mutual understanding. Some exist only to gauge your level of emotional vulnerability. A simple example appears in relationships. When someone says, "I need some time today," a secure person usually respects that, but controlling people turn it into an interrogation. "You're acting strange. Is there someone else? Why did you change?" And then the classic mistake begins. Over-explaining while trying to avoid misunderstandings. But the more the person tries to clarify, the more the other realizes they've found a sensitive point. It's almost like opening a secret door without noticing. In professional environments, this also happens all the time. Manipulative bosses love employees who justify every detail, because those who feel a constant need for validation rarely sustain real confrontation. And this creates a dangerous dynamic where the individual begins to compromise even their own dignity in order to appear reasonable. Now comes the uncomfortable part. Many people over-explain themselves because they've been trained to believe that being misunderstood means moral failure. But that's an illusion. Not everyone wants to understand you. Some just want to test how much emotional control they have over their reactions. And here comes a silent principle linked to better to be feared than loved. Not in the theatrical sense that internet teenagers like to repeat, but in the psychological sense. People respect more those who can sustain discomfort without begging for immediate understanding, because this conveys inner stability. Someone who doesn't desperately seek approval becomes difficult to manipulate, and that's exactly where many people start to change their posture. They realize that strategic silence has more impact than impeccable justifications. They learn that short phrases preserve more power than huge emotional speeches. "I can't," "I won't," "not today." Simple. No emotional tribunal, no excessive defensiveness. The curious thing is that when someone stops compulsively explaining themselves, certain people get irritated very quickly, because they lose access to the psychological control they had before. And when the other person can no longer easily extract emotional justifications, they need to resort to something much more sophisticated. Something that rarely appears directly, but that completely shapes the perception of those around them without them realizing it. Most people still imagine manipulation as something explicit, shouting, threats, visible confrontations, but the most dangerous games almost never happen that way. Those who truly understand psychological power don't waste energy attacking directly. This creates resistance, generates defense, and can even transform the victim into someone more attentive. The true strategist does something much more efficient. They shape the perception around the person even before the conflict exists. They position themselves, and when someone is well positioned within a narrative, half the battle has already been won without a single open confrontation. Machiavelli deeply understood the value of the appearance of virtue, because reputation, context, and public perception are often worth more than brute force. That's why certain people don't try to destroy you head-on. They prefer to plant small ideas, small doubts, small impressions, a comment here, an irony there. "He's been acting strange. She's been very sensitive lately. I don't know if you can fully trust her." It seems subtle, it seems harmless, but that's how narratives begin to be built. And when the person finally realizes it, they are already reacting within an emotional scenario created by another person weeks or even months ago. The scariest thing is that this happens in all environments: work, family, friendships, relationships. There are people who have mastered the art of shaping social perception without seeming aggressive. They understand that decisions based on real human nature are more effective than impulsive confrontations. Observe certain corporate leaders. Some never directly criticize an employee in front of the group. Instead, they ask strategic questions. Is he, she prepared for this? I don't know if she, he can handle pressure. And that's it. The seed has been planted. Now the entire environment begins to see that person through that lens. This also appears frequently in toxic relationships. The partner doesn't need to openly say, "You're unstable." They simply react to the other person's emotions as if they were exaggerated. They make small jokes. They discreetly roll their eyes. They act as if they are always being unfairly attacked. Little by little, the victim themselves begins to doubt their own perception. And here's a cruel detail. The more emotionally reactive the person becomes, trying to defend themselves, the more they reinforce the very narrative created against them. It's almost a game of psychological chess, where the opponent wants you to attack too early, to appear unbalanced in front of the others. That's why strategically strong people develop something rare these days: positional control. They understand that not every provocation deserves an immediate response. Not every accusation needs to be dismantled on the spot, because sometimes the other person wants exactly that: your public emotional reaction. They want to transform you into the character they've already begun to silently create. And here appears one of the most intelligent applications of the calculated use of force. Winning doesn't always mean confrontation. Sometimes winning means refusing the emotional script they've prepared for you. A powerful example of this happens when someone tries to belittle you in a group using passive-aggressive humor. Most people immediately go on the defensive or react with anger. But those who understand social dynamics perceive something bigger. The objective wasn't the joke. It was to observe your reaction. It was to measure emotional stability. And when the person maintains presence, responds little, or even completely changes the direction of the conversation, they break the invisible mechanism of the game. This deeply bothers manipulators because they depend on emotional predictability to maintain control. But there's an even more uncomfortable detail that almost no one notices. Often the biggest mistake isn't attacking the other person, but the illusion of believing that the world functions based on balanced justice all the time. Few ideas make people as uncomfortable as this one, because from a young age, many people have been taught to believe that acting correctly always produces protection, recognition, and balance, as if the world functioned like an automatic moral scale where everything returns in exactly the same measure. But reality rarely operates that way. And when someone enters adulthood blindly believing in this, they end up becoming vulnerable to people who see human relationships as a game of advantage, influence, and positioning. Machiavelli understood this brutally honestly when he spoke about politics guided by reality, not by ideals. The problem isn't believing in justice. The problem is acting as if everyone shared the same principles. Because when only one side honors emotional, moral, or professional agreements, the other begins to operate with silent advantage. And that's when good people enter endless cycles of frustration. They continue to be correct while the other manipulates the context. They continue to be transparent while the other strategically omits information. They continue to offer understanding while receiving cold calculation in return. And the more they insist on playing a fair game against someone who doesn't follow the same rules, the more emotional wear and tear they accumulate. The curious thing is that manipulative people love individuals who are excessively attached to the idea of perfect justice, because they can predict exactly how they will react. They know they will feel guilty before setting limits. They know they will try to resolve everything by talking. They know they will tolerate absurdities to avoid seeming bad. This creates a very dangerous scenario. The person begins to accept small disrespects because they want to maintain their own image of someone fair, balanced, and understanding. And here appears one of the biggest emotional traps of adult life, confusing maturity with passivity. A classic example occurs in work environments. There is always that competent employee who covers up for others' mistakes, accepts overload, and avoids conflict to maintain harmony. At first, they seem admirable. Then they become an operational target, because the entire system learns that it can push more weight onto them without real resistance. In relationships, this is also brutal. Some people use guilt as a constant tool. They make mistakes, disappear, manipulate, but the moment the other person reacts, they reverse the situation emotionally. They make the victim feel cruel simply for finally setting a limit. And those who don't understand true human nature fall for this repeatedly, because they believe that being infinitely understanding will awaken moral conscience in others. But some people don't respect kindness. They respect consequences. And here's a hard truth. Avoiding being hated doesn't mean silently accepting everything. Many people destroy their own authority trying to maintain universal approval. But strategically strong people understand something essential. Clear boundaries inevitably displease those who profited from their absence, and that's part of the game. The end justifies the means takes on an interesting meaning here when applied to emotional protection. Because sometimes the healthiest response doesn't seem pretty externally. Sometimes it seems cold, distant, inflexible, not because the person has lost their humanity, but because they finally understood that emotional survival requires calibration based on reality, not on the fantasy of automatic reciprocity. This doesn't mean becoming cruel or manipulative for no reason. It means developing proportionality. If someone operates with recurring disrespect, perhaps excessive understanding will only prolong the problem. And the more someone realizes this, the more they begin to notice another extremely powerful invisible mechanism. Manipulative people almost always work with urgency. They pressure decisions, accelerate emotions, and create a constant feeling that everything needs to be resolved now, because they know that calm individuals see things that emotionally pressured people completely miss. Almost no one realizes how much speed has become a tool of modern manipulation. Everything today seems to demand an immediate response. Messages need to be answered quickly, decisions need to be made quickly, emotions need to be resolved quickly. And the faster a person lives, the less they perceive what is really happening around them. This is no accident. Anyone who understands human dynamics knows that urgency reduces critical perception. It is much easier to influence someone who is emotionally tired, pressured, or anxious than someone who is calm and observant. Machiavelli understood this when he spoke about constant adaptability, because those who master their own rhythm are rarely led by the rhythm of others. Observe negotiations, discussions, or even relationships. There is almost always someone trying to speed up the process. Decide quickly. You need to answer now. If you don't do it today, you'll miss the opportunity. It seems like just common pressure of modern life, but often it's a psychological strategy, because hurried people react, calm people observe, and those who observe perceive invisible details. They perceive contradictions. They perceive emotional manipulations. They perceive inconsistencies hidden under charisma, urgency, or the appearance of need. Silence also comes into play here as an extremely underestimated weapon. And not that theatrical silence from cheap motivational films, but strategic silence, the ability to not automatically fill all the empty spaces due to emotional anxiety. Manipulative people often use psychological discomfort to elicit reactions. They make calculated pauses, disappear on purpose, create tension, leave questions hanging in the air, all this to see who loses control first. But those who develop emotional stability understand a powerful thing. Not every silence needs to be broken. In many cases, whoever speaks first reveals their emotional position. A simple example occurs in salary negotiations. Insecure people over-justify their own worth, talk compulsively, and try to convince the other person all the time. Someone emotionally solid, however, can sustain pauses without desperation, and this completely changes the psychological dynamic of the conversation. The same happens in personal conflicts. When someone provokes expecting an immediate reaction and encounters unexpected calm, they lose emotional reference because they were prepared to control impulses, not presence. That's why the calculated use of force rarely appears as an emotional explosion. Most of the time, it appears as restraint, like someone who knows exactly when not to act. And this deeply disturbs people who are used to controlling environments through psychological pressure. There's an even deeper detail. People who are always on the go live in a constant state of emotional survival. They confuse movement with progress. They respond to everything instantly. They solve everything immediately. They are always available. And without realizing it, they teach others to have unlimited access to their own energy. But strategically, strong individuals learn something uncomfortable. Excessive availability destroys perceived value. Loyal armies weren't built by leaders desperate for constant approval. They were built by figures who knew how to maintain presence, rhythm, and emotional authority. This still holds true today. People respect more what they can't access automatically all the time, and not because of childish games, but because natural limits create psychological weight. A man or woman who can slow down in the face of chaos transmits something rare today: self-control. And self-control generates a perception of silent strength. The curious thing is that when someone truly starts to slow down, many things change. Certain friendships disappear because they depended on instant access. Some people get irritated because they've lost emotional predictability. Others finally begin to respect previously ignored boundaries. And at that moment, the person realizes something extremely valuable. Perhaps true power has never been about reacting quickly, but about making the other person realize that accessing you now requires cost, consequence, and real effort. There's a silent shift that completely transforms how the world treats someone. It doesn't happen when a person becomes more aggressive, louder, or tries to appear powerful all the time. The real turning point happens when they cease to be easy to access, easy to manipulate, easy to predict, because at its core, a large part of human relationships function based on psychological cost. People continue to overstep boundaries as long as they perceive the consequences as small. They continue to use someone emotionally as long as access remains unlimited. And here enters one of the most uncomfortable ideas about real human nature. That which seems available all the time tends to lose perceived value. Machiavelli understood this deeply when he spoke of better to be feared than loved. Not in the caricatured sense of inspiring theatrical fear, but in the sense of generating psychological respect through controlled unpredictability. Strategically strong people don't live reacting instantly. They don't become emotionally accessible on demand. They don't automatically validate anyone who comes along. And this completely changes the game. Because manipulative individuals depend on emotional predictability to operate. They need to know how you react, how much you tolerate, and what makes you give in. When those answers cease to be obvious, attacking you starts to demand too much energy. Think about how many people live completely emotionally exposed today. They show everything, explain everything, react to everything, and are always available. The result? The entire environment quickly learns how to access them psychologically. They know exactly which words to use, which guilts to activate, and which fears to press. But someone who learns to conserve emotional energy begins to create a completely different effect. People start to think twice before crossing certain boundaries, not because they threaten or play childish games, but because now there are real consequences. A simple example appears in social relationships. When someone always accepts cancellations, disrespect, and disappearances without altering their behavior, they teach others that their presence has a low cost. Those who naturally reduce access after repeated disrespect create a perception of emotional value. In professional environments, this is even more evident. Employees who say yes to everything end up receiving infinite pressure. Those who develop a clear stance tend to be treated with more caution. And this happens because politics, guided by reality, not by ideals, produces a simple truth. People adapt much more to consequences than to speeches. It doesn't matter how many times someone says, "You deserve respect," if your actions continue to silently allow the opposite. But perhaps the most powerful part of all this is understanding that becoming valuable doesn't mean becoming cruel. It means becoming selective. It's different. Emotionally mature people understand the calculated use of force, precisely because they know that energy, time, and attention are limited resources. They don't waste their presence trying to convince everyone of their worth. They don't compulsively chase after those who disrespect them. They don't turn emotional abandonment into a rescue mission, because they finally understood something that completely changes life. Those who need to beg for recognition inevitably surrender power. And those who learn to preserve psychological dignity begin to operate on another emotional level. Curiously, when this happens, some people start calling them cold, arrogant, or difficult. But almost always, these criticisms come precisely from those who have lost easy access to the emotional control they once had. And here arises one of the most profound applications of virtù and fortuna. The person realizes that real strength is not about dominating others. It's about preventing others from constantly dominating their reactions. And when someone finally reaches this point, they begin to see the world differently. Conversations change, relationships change. The silence itself takes on a different weight, because now there is something rare there. Someone who has learned to live without offering their own emotional peace as open territory for anyone to invade. Ultimately, the game was never about becoming the cruelest person in the room. It was about ceasing to be the easiest to manipulate. Because there's a huge difference between kindness and naivete, between peace and passivity, between maturity and emotional submission. And most people only realize this too late, after years of over-explaining, over-tolerating, and offering unlimited access to their own energy to people who never intended to protect what they received. Machiavelli understood something that still bothers many people to accept. The world respects those who understand real human nature, not those who live trapped in the fantasy that everyone will act according to the same principles. And perhaps the greatest transformation happens precisely when someone stops trying to appear good all the time, and finally begins to become impossible to control emotionally. Now think honestly. How many times have you confused being understanding with accepting disrespect? How many times have you over-explained, trying to convince someone to acknowledge something that should already be obvious? How many times have you felt guilty for setting boundaries while other people never felt guilty for crossing them? These questions are unsettling because they reveal silent patterns, and patterns define destiny. Manipulative people rarely change because someone gave a nice speech about morality. They change when they see the consequences, when they understand that access has become expensive, when they realize they can no longer easily predict their reactions. And perhaps that's exactly when your life truly begins to change, not when the world becomes more just, but when you finally learn to operate based on reality, not just ideals. So tell me something in the comments. Which of these secrets resonated with you the most today? At what point in your life did you realize you were being manipulated without noticing? I want to know, because sometimes what you write can open the eyes of someone else who is still trapped in the exact same emotional trap. And if you want to continue learning about strategy, human nature, psychological power, Machiavelli, silent influence, and how to develop an unmanipulated presence, subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications. Because while most continue living on autopilot, a select few are beginning to see the invisible game that has always been happening right before their eyes.